The chamber was deathly silent, save for the rhythmic clang of armored boots against cold metal. The air smelled of ozone and burnt circuitry, the lingering remnants of past executions. Elias Vance, bound at the wrists, was dragged forward by two towering Zalvok enforcers. Their reptilian grips dug into his arms, claws scraping against his torn uniform. He didn't resist. There was no point. The trial had been a formality, the verdict a foregone conclusion. Now, the only thing left was the show, the execution of a human commander before an audience of his conquerors. The tribunal loomed ahead, a semicircle of high-ranking Zalvok officials draped in ceremonial battle robes. At the center stood High Adjudicator Craxus, his scaled visage framed by a heavy mantle of authority. His yellow, slit-pupiled eyes studied Elias with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen. Craxus tapped his staff against the floor, the sharp crack echoing through the chamber. Elias Vance, you are accused of orchestrating insurgencies against the Zalvok Dominion, of inciting rebellion, and of defying the natural order. Your actions have led to the deaths of thousands of our kind. The sentence is death. A low murmur of approval rippled through the gathered dignitaries. Elias exhaled slowly. He kept his expression neutral, but his mind raced. He noted the positioning of the enforcers, the distance to the nearest guard, the layout of the chamber. Not that it mattered. There was no escape, only inevitability. A Zalvok executioner stepped forward, clad in ceremonial warplate. The massive, curved blade in his hands gleamed under the cold artificial lights, its edge sharpened to molecular precision. A weapon designed not just to kill, but to demonstrate. Elias was forced to his knees. The enforcers gripped his shoulders, holding him in place as the executioner raised the blade high. The crowd hushed. He could hear his own heartbeat. Steady, measured. Then he spoke. Do you know what happens when you execute a human? His voice, hoarse from captivity, carried through the chamber. The executioner hesitated. Craxus's eyes narrowed. You dare speak now at the end? Elias turned his head slightly, just enough to meet the adjudicator's gaze. At the end? No, this isn't the end. His lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. This is the beginning. Silence. The Zalvok, for all their dominance, were not accustomed to uncertainty. They were a species of conquest, of absolute control. This moment, this pause, was foreign to them. Craxus recovered first. Your defiance is meaningless. Your kind is weak. Your last words will be as insignificant as your resistance. Elias chuckled, low and humorless. Weak? That's what you think, isn't it? He shifted slightly under the enforcer's grip, not to escape, but to command the space. That's why you're losing. The murmurs in the chamber grew louder. Craxus's expression darkened. We are not losing. Your so-called rebellion is a nuisance, nothing more. Your species is fractured, leaderless. We have crushed your fleets, taken your worlds. Your defiance will end here, as will your life. Elias tilted his head. Then why are you afraid? A ripple of unease passed through the gathered Zalvok. It was subtle, but it was there. Craxus scoffed. We do not fear insects. Elias leaned forward as much as the enforcers allowed, his voice dropping just enough to make them strain to listen. That's where you're wrong. You think humanity fights wars like you do. You think if you break our armies, burn our cities, and kill our leaders, we'll submit. His voice hardened. But you don't understand what you've done. Killing me won't end your war. It will ignite something far worse. The executioner, still holding the blade high, glanced at Craxus, awaiting the order. Elias saw the hesitation. Good. You're used to species that lose, he continued, his words precise, each syllable another crack in their certainty. But humans don't lose. Not the way you think. You've studied our battles, our wars. But you've never truly understood what happens when you push us too far. Craxus's claws tapped against the armrest of his elevated seat. A slow, deliberate movement. You think we're weak because we die easily, Elias said, voice unwavering. But we don't fight to live. We fight to win. And if we can't win, He let the words hang for a moment. Then, softly, almost gently, he said, "We make sure you lose too." The chamber felt colder. The weight of history pressed into the silence. The long, bloody legacy of a species that had turned desperation into victory time and time again. Elias inhaled deeply, his shoulders rising, then exhaled, letting the silence work for him. Then he switched to the Zalvokan dialect, a language humans were not supposed to know. Ask yourselves, warriors of the Dominion, why am I still speaking? His pronunciation was flawless. Shock rippled through the tribunal. The gathered dignitaries stiffened. Even the enforcers gripping him tensed, their claws momentarily loosening. Craxus's eyes widened, just a fraction, but Elias saw it. The executioner lowered his blade by an inch. Elias pressed on. "I know things you do not, things that would shatter your empire if spoken aloud." He let the weight of that linger, watching as realization set in. Craxus's jaw tightened. He waved a clawed hand. The executioner froze, then took a step back. Elias smiled. The execution had been halted. For now. The execution chamber remained deathly still, the weight of Elias's words hanging in the air like the final note of a funeral dirge. The executioner's blade, moments from severing his life, hovered just above the ground. Across the tribunal, slit-pupiled eyes flicked between Craxus and the human prisoner, uncertainty creeping into their once impenetrable expressions. The Zalvok did not hesitate in matters of death, and yet here they stood, pausing, considering, doubting. Elias remained on his knees, his body aching from weeks of confinement, but his mind was razor-sharp. He had seen the hesitation, the tiny fracture in their resolve. That was all he needed. He straightened slightly, rolling his shoulders against the enforcer's grip, testing their response. They held firm, but no longer crushed with the same force. That, too, was a victory. Craxus's voice cut through the silence, each syllable precise, clipped. "Explain yourself." A lesser man might have taken the demand as permission, an invitation to plead for mercy. Elias was not a lesser man. He smirked, tilting his head as if considering whether the question was even worth answering. A game. That was how this had to be played now, like a predator toying with prey, forcing them to question who was truly in control. "I think you already understand," Elias said, letting his voice carry just enough amusement to needle at their pride. "The question is, do you have the stomach for the truth?" A low murmur rippled through the assembled dignitaries. The Zalvok prided themselves on their dominance, their absolute certainty in their rule. Yet here was a human, bound and beaten, speaking not as a victim, but as an equal, or worse, as something beyond them. Craxus's expression remained unreadable, but the flick of his clawed hand was all it took. The executioner stepped back further, lowering his blade completely. Elias exhaled slowly. The tribunal wasn't done with him yet. Magistrate Vorthal, a Zalvok with deep crimson markings across his ridged skull, stepped forward. His eyes, sharper than the others, fixed on Elias like a blade pressing to his throat. "You claim to know things. Secrets of the Dominion." His voice was laced with skepticism, but beneath it, Elias detected something else, curiosity. "I don't claim," Elias corrected. "I know." He let the weight of that settle before continuing. "For example, I know about your supply lines. The ones you think are secure. The ones that at this very moment are being sabotaged from within." The reaction was immediate. Several of the tribunal members exchanged glances, subtle but telling. Vorthal's grip tightened on the ceremonial staff he carried. Elias filed that away. "So, I was right." Craxus's voice was a blade honed to a whisper. "How?" Elias smiled, slow and knowing. "Because you're not as invincible as you think. Because you rely on fear to keep your empire together, and fear is a fickle thing." He shifted slightly, testing his bindings, his gaze never leaving the adjudicator. "You've built your dominion on the assumption that the conquered will stay conquered. That's your mistake." A sharp chuff of irritation came from one of the tribunal members. "Enough riddles, human. If you have something to say, say it." Elias turned his gaze to the speaker, a broad-shouldered Zalvok with deep emerald scales. Fine. I'll be direct. There are Zalvok officers in your ranks who have already turned against you. You just don't know it yet. The tribunal erupted into a frenzy of overlapping voices, some dismissive, others clearly disturbed. Craxus remained still, but the slight narrowing of his eyes told Elias he had struck the right nerve. Vorthal's voice cut through the noise. You lie. Elias only shrugged. Do I? He let the silence stretch, the weight of his certainty pressing against their disbelief. Tell me, how many unexpected accidents have your fleet suffered in the past month? How many shipments have gone missing without a trace? How many orders have been countermanded before they reached the front? He tilted his head. And how many times have you told yourselves it was just bad luck? The murmuring returned, more agitated this time. The Zalvok did not believe in coincidences. If there was one thing their kind feared more than rebellion, it was weakness from within. Elias saw it in their eyes now. The doubt. Craxus tapped his staff against the ground once, silencing the room. If you truly possess this knowledge, why would you share it? You gain nothing from this. Elias chuckled. You think I care about gaining something? This isn't a negotiation. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something darker. This is a warning. Silence. He let it hang before driving the knife deeper. You can kill me. Right here, right now. His gaze swept over them, meeting every set of alien eyes that dared to hold his own. But that won't stop what's coming. Humanity isn't an army. It's not a fleet. It's not a planet. His voice sharpened, words precise as a blade. Humanity is an idea, and ideas don't die. The weight of his words settled over the tribunal like a gathering storm. Craxus exhaled slowly, nostrils flaring. He glanced at Vorthal, something unspoken passing between them. Then he turned back to Elias. Take him, the adjudicator ordered. The enforcers yanked Elias to his feet, their grips tighter now, as if they feared he might slip through their claws. Elias smirked. They were afraid. Good. Elias was dragged through the labyrinthine halls of the Zalvok citadel, his boots scuffing against the smooth obsidian floors. The enforcers held him tighter than before, their claws digging into his arms, though whether out of frustration or fear, he couldn't tell. Probably both. He had given them something dangerous, doubt, and now they were scrambling to decide what to do with him. He had seen it in Craxus's eyes, in the wary glances between the tribunal members. They wanted to kill him. They needed to. But not before they were certain. The corridors twisted in unnatural angles, architecture designed to be disorienting to the uninitiated. Elias made note of every turn, every change in the texture of the walls beneath his fingertips. He had no illusions of escape, not yet, but knowing the layout was never a waste. The enforcers flanked him as they reached a heavy set of reinforced doors. One of them pressed a clawed hand against a control panel, and with a deep hiss, the doors slid open to reveal a dimly lit chamber. Not a cell, not an interrogation room, something else. Elias was shoved inside. He caught himself before he could stumble, straightening as he took in his surroundings. The room was circular, lined with tall, curved data consoles that pulsed with faint blue light. At its center was a raised platform, and standing beside it, waiting, was Craxus. The adjudicator studied Elias with the measured gaze of a predator evaluating wounded prey. The enforcers remained by the door, standing rigid, waiting for orders. Craxus gestured toward the platform. Step forward. Elias didn't move. And if I don't? Craxus's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile. Then I will have my enforcers break both of your legs and place you there. Elias sighed. See, this is why no one likes you. One of the enforcers snarled and took a step forward, but Craxus held up a hand, stopping him. The adjudicator's gaze never wavered. Elias exhaled slowly, then stepped onto the platform. The moment he did, the blue light surrounding the consoles intensified. Thin arcs of energy crackled through the air. Elias felt something crawl over his skin, an invisible presence pressing against his thoughts. A scanner. So that was their game. They weren't just going to interrogate him. They were going to extract the truth, one way or another. Craxus stepped closer, his voice calm, measured. You have spoken of betrayals within our ranks, of sabotage, of insurgents hiding among us. His pupils narrowed to thin slits. You will now prove it. Elias flexed his fingers, suppressing the instinct to step back. He could feel the scanner now, like a phantom tendril wrapping around his skull, sifting through memories, through thoughts. It wasn't a brute force method, not the kind that would leave him drooling on the floor. It was precise, designed to pull what was needed, without breaking the subject entirely. They were looking for confirmation. They needed him to slip, to let the scanner latch onto a genuine memory. He couldn't let that happen. Elias closed his eyes, slowed his breathing. He had been trained for this, not just in resisting interrogation, but in misleading it. Misdirection, half-truths, the art of guiding the enemy exactly where you wanted them to go. Images flickered through his mind. Data relays burning. Explosions rupturing the hulls of Zalvok warships. Names whispered in the dark, false leads, and fabricated betrayals. He let the scanner see these things, let it taste them, but only just enough to whet its appetite. Craxus watched the console as streams of alien script scrolled across its surface. His expression remained neutral, but Elias knew what he was looking for. Patterns, inconsistencies, anything that suggested a lie. Finally, the adjudicator spoke. These events, they are real. Elias opened his eyes. Of course they are. Craxus studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned to the enforcers. Leave us. The enforcers hesitated, exchanging glances. But one nod from Craxus was all it took. They filed out of the room. The doors sealing shut behind them. The chamber was silent now, save for the hum of the scanners. Craxus took a step closer. Then, another. You speak as though you are unafraid, he said. As though you hold the upper hand. Elias smirked. And you're acting like you haven't already lost control of this situation. Craxus tilted his head. Have I? Elias exhaled, shifting his stance. You're afraid. Craxus's nostrils flared. I fear nothing. Elias chuckled, shaking his head. No, see, that's your problem. You think fear is weakness. That's why you've never understood humans. Fear is what makes us dangerous. It sharpens us, makes us faster, smarter. When we're cornered, when we're afraid, that's when we win. Craxus regarded him carefully. You are still a prisoner. Your rebellion is still fractured. And you are a lone human. Elias met his gaze without hesitation. Am I? The chamber's lights flickered. A small thing. A barely noticeable change. But Craxus saw it. And in that moment, Elias saw something else. Just a flicker, just a hint, doubt. Not in Elias. In himself. The flickering lights pulsed again, a brief tremor in the steady hum of the Citadel's power grid. Elias didn't react. He didn't need to. The silence stretching between him and Craxus was doing the work for him, feeding the unspoken tension that now filled the chamber like a rising tide. Craxus was still watching him, unmoving, unreadable. But something had shifted. A slight tension in the adjudicator's posture, a flicker of calculation behind his reptilian eyes. He was weighing options now, considering outcomes. Elias let the moment stretch. Then he exhaled slowly, shifting his stance just enough to suggest ease, though his muscles remained taut beneath the surface. It's happening, isn't it? His voice was quiet, measured. You feel it. You know. Craxus didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his words were slow, deliberate. What have you done? Elias almost smiled. Not me. Them. Another flicker in the lights. This time, it didn't stabilize right away. The hum of the scanners wavered, their glow dimming for a fraction of a second before returning to full brightness. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible. But for a species that built its empire on control, any deviation from order was an infection waiting to spread. Craxus took a single step back, as if adjusting his perspective. You are bluffing. Elias tilted his head. Am I? A distant boom echoed through the structure. Faint but undeniable. The sound of something rupturing. The adjudicator's pupils narrowed to thin slits, his gaze flicking toward the sealed chamber doors for the first time since they had closed. Elias folded his arms despite the restraints. You spent so much time crushing resistance that you forgot to look for the ones already inside your walls. He let the words sink in before continuing. All that talk about dominance, about humanity being weak. But here's the thing, Craxus. You don't win wars by being the strongest. You win them by being the last one standing. A second explosion, closer this time. The chamber lights wavered again. The hum of the scanners stuttered. Craxus exhaled through flared nostrils. Your people are reckless. Even if they succeed in disrupting this facility, it will not bring down the Dominion. Elias nodded, as if conceding the point. Maybe not, but it will start something you can't stop. He took a step forward, testing the boundaries, watching for a reaction. That's the part you never understood. We don't need to win in a single strike. We just need to make sure you never feel safe again. The chamber doors remained sealed, but the sounds beyond them were changing. Movement, shouts, the unmistakable hiss of plasma discharges. Craxus's expression hardened. You think this proves something? His voice was quieter now, no longer filled with the certainty it once carried. You are still a prisoner. Your people may have infiltrated this citadel, but they will fall like the others. Elias held his gaze. Then why haven't you given the order to kill me? Craxus didn't answer. Another impact. This one closer. The floor trembled beneath them. The lights flickered again, longer this time. Elias watched the adjudicator carefully, searching for the moment. The break. The fracture. He had pushed the knife in already. Now, he had to twist it. You feel it now, don't you? His voice was softer, almost sympathetic. The fear. Not of dying. Not of losing a battle. Of losing control. He let the silence stretch. Then, with quiet certainty, he said, "That's why you're afraid of us." For the first time, something flickered across Craxus's face. Something dangerously close to recognition. The chamber doors groaned. The sound of forced entry reverberating through the room. The enforcers stationed outside shouted in their guttural dialect. Then, with a deafening crack, the door buckled. Craxus turned, his posture rigid. Elias took his chance. He lunged. Not at Craxus. Not at the consoles. At the scanners. His shoulder slammed into the nearest array, sending it crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks. The backlash hit him like a freight train, static crawling over his skin, white-hot pain lancing through his skull. He hit the ground hard, his vision flickering with phantom afterimages. But the scanner was dead. The lights overhead surged once more, then plunged into darkness. A beat of silence. Then the doors burst open. Silhouettes flooded the chamber, human forms outlined in the glow of emergency lights. The sounds of plasma fire erupted in the hall beyond, but here, in this space, there was only stillness. Elias pushed himself onto his elbows, breathing hard. He felt hands grab his arms, but this time, the grip was familiar. Commander. A voice he recognized. Lieutenant Sarno, his second in command. You still with us? Elias forced a smirk, his head still throbbing. Took you long enough. Sarno grinned, already cutting through his restraints. Had to make an entrance. Elias turned his gaze back to Craxus. The adjudicator hadn't moved. His eyes locked onto Elias with something unreadable. Not anger. Not hatred. Something worse. Understanding. Elias stood as the restraints fell away, rolling his shoulders. He met Craxus's gaze one final time. Then he turned and walked out into the war he had just begun.